All right. So, psilocybin 101. So, I've got four different books that I get royalties from. Not much, I will tell you, but they do get some royalties. And we've gotten research support for our different sponsored FDA approved psychedelic studies, including MAPS, Lykos, MindMed, and Beckley SciTech, as well as Flourish Trust, which has provided grants for other research for us. The agenda tonight, as I mentioned, we're going to look at psilocybin in some depth after we go through a framework on what the psychedelic approach really is, understanding the three main components of that. Then we'll talk about how this brings in spiritual dimensions of care. And then Mary's going to cover the Colorado context and how we've been able to be innovative with legally supported psychedelic treatment in Colorado. So, psychedelic medicine, it seems like it's a new medicine, but it's actually been around for millennia. There are caves in South America where they have evidence of the use of San Pedro, which is a mescaline containing cactus going back thousands of years. Native American medicine using peyote at the left, and then also the Mazatec tradition going back also millennia in the hills of Mexico. So these have been used by shaman all over the world in terms of their ability to create alterations in consciousness and bring healing with that. Um, so let's just create some definitions so we're all on the same page. So classic psychedelics such as LSD, mescaline, DMT, and psilocybin create significant alterations in consciousness. They can have visual distortions, even hallucinations. Then we have a group called empathogens. This includes things like MDA, MDMA, and 3-MMC. These are also called heart openers, entheogens. There's a variety of different terms, but basically, they don't create as much in the way of profound alterations in consciousness, but they tend to help people feel peaceful, relaxed, and open-hearted. We have a different group, sort of a miscellaneous category of psychedelics, such as iboga, which contains ibogaine, and 2CB. These agents have some elements of both of the first two categories, empathogens and classical psychedelics, but fit neither one quite cleanly. Then finally, we have the dissociative agents. These are all relatively new. Nitrous oxide has been around for probably 150 years, was investigated by William James back in the late 1800s, and many people wrote about it. Ketamine, a more recent introduction, and dextromethorphan, which is found in Robitussin and other cough syrups. These all create a sense of dissociation, a disconnection, but they can also have psychedelic-like effects. And we've had these two different arms of mental health care in the last 50 to 70 years. We've had the psychopharmacology on one hand and the psychotherapy on the other. And the psychotherapy is still pretty much in ways similar to the talk therapy that Freud developed um, over 100 years ago. Two people sit together and through conversation and dialogue create some process of healing. Pharmacology is using medication to adjust neurotransmitters and try to bring some element of change to the process. And um, now, what's interesting with psychedelic medicine is it really brings these two arms together. And what we see is a number of different benefits of engagement, access to trauma, heightened awareness, motivation to change, increase alignment with the practitioner, and perhaps most consistently enhance neuroplasticity. This is a way of saying that it creates the opportunity for change within the nervous system. And most of the people that come to see us come not for any one particular problem, but it's the fact that they feel stuck and they're looking to see how they can change their lives. And neuroplasticity is a way of saying that this makes change that much easier. It makes change more fluid and more change is possible in this way. So, what exactly is the psychedelic framework? Well, one way of thinking about it, the way that I usually teach when I'm training professionals, is it includes three key elements: the container, the catalyst, and the carrier. And um, the container is not that dissimilar to the container of trust, rapport, connection that's built between a psychotherapist and the person that they're working with. What's different in the psychedelic state is there has to be a higher level of trust because there's more vulnerability. There's more unpredictability in the psychedelic space. So the container is critically important. The second element is the catalyst. These are agents that alter the flow of information within our consciousness. This can be things like ketamine, MDMA, but it can even be breath work. Um, it can be really anything that alters the flow of information. So it doesn't have to be a chemical. Often chemicals are easier, perhaps more reliable way to induce this. But the main concept is it has to change the flow of information and create a change in awareness and consciousness. And then finally, we have the carrier. These are things like headphones, eye shades. The whole goal of this is to try to drive the experience inside, because if people have an experience where it's externalized and they're looking at nature, the room, or the person across from them, they won't have the same depth of inner experience and the same possibility of therapeutic change. So these three elements together, container, catalyst, and carrier, create the psychedelic framework. So all these things together create this possibility for a new form of psychotherapy where the medicine and the psychotherapy is working together to the same ends. And what we see in today's mental health care is that these are often two very disparate, disconnected, and often working at cross purposes. For example, psychiatric medications often make people uh, more sedated, tired, sluggish, less insightful, and it may actually impair the process of psychotherapy and change. And these agents do not seem to enhance neuroplasticity. Right now, I think there's now seven. This slide is not fully up to date. I think there's now seven that have been given breakthrough therapy status by the FDA. And this is assisted psychotherapy with MDMA, psilocybin, LSD, DMT. These are all sort of novel to the FDA in the last few years. When MDMA submitted this and received breakthrough therapy in 2017, there had never been a prior submission to the FDA like this. The FDA approves drugs. They understand drugs. They do not understand therapy. And this has created some real problems in the consideration and approval process for commercialization of these agents. And it's really helpful to know that psilocybin is going through a commercialization process with the FDA, which would make it available by prescription in all 50 states. And what's happened in Colorado and Oregon is a different process. And Mary can speak more to the differences in those two things. But right now, none of these agents have been approved by the FDA, although they are getting much closer. And some people even say we may see approval of MDMA this year or psilocybin later this year or early next year. So they're coming. It's not a matter of if, but more a matter of when. So I think one of the things about psychedelics that makes them so intriguing is they really open up inner worlds for discovery. And we'll see how this relates as we move through this dialogue together, what this looks like. So we know that psychedelics have a profound impact on the brain. They have a profound impact on the default mode network. Here's a look at your brain on a placebo on the left side, and you can see that there are a lot of all these lines are tracks and networks in the brain, and the dots are hubs within the brain. And so you can see that most of the pathways are short haul and sort of canalized is the word we use, that they're sort of repetitious high frequency routes. And on the right, you see a brain on psilocybin. And what you can see is it just opens up so much more interconnectivity in the brain. And this is perhaps even the very definition of what neuroplasticity is. This is a picture here of the default mode network, which is a system of hubs and networks and connectivity within the brain that is sort of our best equivalent of ego, of self. It's our inner narrative, it's our biases, it's our sense of who we are. Now, one of the interesting things about psychedelics is they dramatically alter the impact of the default mode network. And this is electrophysiology within the brain on psilocybin. If you can see my cursor here in the center, this what it says DMN, default mode network, and you can see how dramatically psilocybin in the red affects this compared to the blue or the placebo. Dramatic decreases in the impact of the default mode network. So, how does psilocybin work? The mechanism on one level is fairly simple 5-HT2A mainly receptors. Um, and we know this is true because there is an agent, uh, canancerin, which actually will block the effects of psilocybin at these receptors and prevent psychedelic effects. So we know that this is how these receptors work. Now, one of the interesting things is that 5-HT2A receptors change our ability to cope and manage stress. SSRIs work through 5-HT1, and that just merely helps us adapt to the stress. It doesn't help us to change and adapt or change to it, but it just helps us to tolerate stress better. So they don't really change anything. They just give us some symptomatic control, which tends to wear out over time. And I can see we have a cat moving across the screen there for Annie. Lovely cat. Now, one of the interesting things also about psychedelics is that one or two doses actually creates lasting change. Now, with an SSRI, you have to take those doses every day to get an impact. And what's different with psychedelics such as psilocybin, which this study shows, is you can see at baseline the depression score was up around 20. It drops to less than 10 1 week later, stays down 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 5 weeks, and even further out at 3 months and 6 months. And that's one of the things that's remarkable about this, and we'll talk about how this may be happening. But this is changing our understanding about how agents can work within the brain as we move from a mechanistic model to a more systems-based understanding of how the brain works and how we can create durable change. Um, and this is fascinating. Another study by Chuck Raison of the University of Wisconsin in Madison. He did a large randomized controlled study for Usona with 104 adults with major depressive disorder. They used an active comparator, which is important. And what they found is that a single 25 milligram dose created rapid and sustained antidepressant effects, much like the Carhart-Harris slide that I showed you prior. So we've got a rather consistent series of studies, and a recent meta-analysis looking at 12 different studies showed much the same effect with um, an effect size of close to 1, which is really much, much better than we see with SSRIs that have an effect size of zero point 0.3 perhaps. And that does tend to fade very quickly, even when you're taking the medication. So this is really a different model of care. This is the Chuck Raison study. Interestingly, we trained Chuck and the USONA crew from the University of Wisconsin at Wholeness about 5 years ago in ketamine assisted work. Chuck's a great guy, a really thoughtful and well thought of mainstream psychiatric researcher. But here's sort of a visual representation of his study. In the top half of the graph, you can see the niacin folks had some slight improvements, but they did not sustain. And what you see is really sustained change at 8, 15, 29, and 43 weeks for the folks with psilocybin, single dose. So once again, very different model we're working at. Now, here's an interesting study done by Alan Davis at Ohio State University. And this was published first in JAMA Psychiatry and then more recently a follow-up study, 5-year follow-up study in the Journal of Psychedelic Studies. And what they found is that 5 years later, that the vast majority of these people were still showing very significant improvements. And this is really, I think, a breakthrough study in terms of that 18 participants out of the 21 that were originally studied showed significant benefits. And how they included the people lost to follow-up was they just included their original scores of depression and figured that these would just have stayed the same. And perhaps the reason they didn't want to be interviewed is because they were still depressed. So they just calibrated them as still depressed at the same level and still showing very significant results for the group as a whole 5 years later. And so oops, sorry. I think here's a representation of the Davis study from the Journal of Psychedelic Studies published in September. And what they showed, the drop at 1 week. And what's interesting is one of the things we see with psilocybin in particular is often the next day or even 2 days later, people still can be somewhat depressed. And often the depression doesn't lift, sometimes for a week, sometimes even for a few weeks, but it drops down and then it tends to stay down. And I think this is the kind of study that we really need in modern psychiatry, but I don't think we want because most often our conventional psychiatric meds, the improvements deteriorate typically in the 3 month, 6 month, 1 year frame, and people need to come back in for med checks to have some adjustment in their medications because the body is attempting to correct what the medication is doing. A totally different model of care with psilocybin and that it's changing something internal. And we're going to talk about that in a second. But we can also see that it goes beyond major depression. And if we think about that these things are actually shifting our belief systems and our self-concept, that it doesn't narrowly leave them to have effectiveness with either major depression or anxiety, but really transdiagnostic improvement. And that's what we're seeing with psychedelics, that it can help existential related distress, substance abuse disorders, OCD, anxiety, and PTSD. We're seeing results of research with these agents showing benefit across all these different areas. This transdiagnostic framework is helping us to understand that psychedelics probably go in and actually affect the very operating system that we have, our concept of ourself and who we are. So it's working much more fundamentally than just simply at a neurotransmitter mechanism. So a few thoughts about safety and risk. Um, oh, don't mind Grandpa. He's just having an acid flashback. So the boomer generation is now getting a little long in the tooth, and this is just a slightly humorous take on some of the side effects we might see. What's actually interesting is there's something called a persistent perceptual disorder with psychedelics, and of note, it's not been really seen in our psychiatric research with these agents. It's more found in the field when people are taking multiple agents in uncontrolled settings that this can be a problem. This is a very interesting study by David Nutt out of Imperial College in the UK. And what he did is he looked at all psychoactive agents and saw how much harm they create to self and others in a very in-depth study. And what's interesting, if you look at this scale with alcohol at one end and at the other end, mushrooms, i.e., psilocybin. So these are among the safest psychoactive agents that we know of. And if you look at this thing where you have alcohol, heroin, crack cocaine, methamphetamine, cocaine, tobacco, cannabis, on down the list, you can see that our public policy around these agents doesn't tend to make much sense. Um, and that mushrooms and LSD and even ecstasy should be legal, and alcohol and tobacco should be illegal. But that's not the way our society operates, unfortunately. Um, so, a review in JAMA recently said these agents look to be generally well tolerated. Although serious adverse effects did occur, they they don't see catastrophic events, and people are really tolerating these agents very well. So, very, very serious, lasting, or persisting effects tend not to be seen. The side effects we see are mostly nausea, headache, fatigue, and those tend to resolve within a day or two. This is a very pivotal study. This probably launched the psychedelic renaissance that we're now in, the second wave, about 20 years ago. And this study, published by Roland Griffiths, who died a few years ago from Johns Hopkins, found that a single dose with psilocybin can cause profound and prolonged changes in people. And if we look into this, this was a single dose. And what's interesting is that 83% of the people who received a dose of psilocybin said this was a top five event in their life, on par with the death of a child or the birth of a child or the death of a parent and or someone's marriage. I mean, their dose of psilocybin was in that category. And almost 90% of them said this created behavioral change that's sustained for 14 months after the dosing. And what do people see when people have a mystical experience? This is from a number of studies, but they have this sense of connection, a sense of connection with the universe, with others, and also with themselves more deeply. And this creates a whole range of effects that seem to sort of spread out from there. Love of others, decreased hatred, increased gratitude, increased reverence, increased sense of altruism. These things tend to grow from a mystical experience with a classical psychedelic agent. And these things often seem to be what drives our healing. And this is a report by Jerome Saris from Melbourne in the UK. And the therapeutic gains in psychedelic research seem to derive primarily from the mystical experience quality rather from the psychedelic intensity. And the degree of mystical experience that people have correlates with those reporting complete or almost complete improvement after a single experience. And as we try to understand what's happening here, it's not like this experience is creating a neurochemical change. What it's creating is a change in the sense of meaning that we have in our lives, and that drives how we see ourselves in the world. And this has far reaching impact to people. And so these elements that happen in the mystical experience, the most important one is this sense of oneness with the universe. A number of other things happen, ineffability, that means you can't put words to this. There's a positive mood, there's a sense of sacredness, there's a sense of transcendence and going beyond. And this this mystical experience has been known to happen with psychedelics, but also with near-death experiences, with religious conversion, for people on that are going on pilgrimage. Eh, these things have been written about for thousands of years. Mystical experience is something that's not limited to psychedelics, but this is just rather a little more predictable path for us to create this process. And we now know that a single psychedelic experience can change people's metaphysical framework. This is just fascinating research that has me intrigued. And I think probably as I wrap this up, that one of the things that we can see is that these psychedelic agents can act as a spiritual catalyst where they accelerate a change with us, where we see ourselves in different relationship to the world, in greater connection to ourself, others, the universe, nature, and the community that we live, work, and play in. And this is an innate process. It's not something that's unique to psychedelics, but they really help us to remove artificial barriers that our culture, even our healthcare and our science create for us. And they begin to heal this mind-body split. And I've just found that I've been interested in these agents and working with them for close to 40 years. I was able to work with MDMA before it was scheduled by the FDA in 1985. And, I was really stimulated to look into these things by my mentor, Andrew Weil, who taught at the University of Arizona Medical School while I was in attendance. And it's been something that has stayed with me. And one of the things about these mystical experiences is they really can stick with you 20 and 40 years later. And it's just been a provocative introduction to working with people in a deeper spiritual way, but also finding new ways that we can heal and help people who are struggling. And I've just been really impressed by the work that these agents can do in helping people find healing and find their wholeness. So, with that, I'd like to hand it over to my partner, Dr. Mary Rondo, who's going to talk about the Colorado context.
Thank you so much, Dr. Shannon. That was so informative. And so to be able to see the studies that have been done with psychedelics and psilocybin specifically, and the possibilities with changing the mental health care system, it's a really beautiful transition to see exactly what's happening. And so it is absolutely an incredibly exciting time in Colorado to be able to utilize psilocybin in a therapeutic setting, so that we can see all of these changes that have been published in the literature. So let's look at a little bit with the legal journey to psychedelic therapies. So specifically in Colorado, back in November 2022, Proposition 122 passed, which basically decriminalized psilocybin and some other psychedelic substances. And then through the path from November of 2022 until mid 2025, which is when the first healing centers open. And so in that time, development of the process through kind of the legislative component happened. And so as of the end of 2025, Colorado had already treated over 400 clients with psilocybin. There are 27 active healing centers, and there's one co-located healing center. And so co-located healing centers mean that the center doesn't only do psychedelic therapy. So that one co-located healing center is Wholeness, where it is actually our psilocybin therapy is embedded into our behavioral health center. In Oregon, Oregon also started a program a little bit before Colorado, and so started in mid 2023. And so since then, Oregon has treated 15,000 plus clients that have seeked out psilocybin therapy in Oregon, and they have 24 operating service centers. And there are no co-located healing centers or service centers in Oregon. And then new kid on the block is New Mexico. And so they just passed the legislative act, which is the Medical Psilocybin Act in 2025. So no process, and there's no process for someone to access it now in New Mexico, but that process is on the way. So it'll probably take a couple of years to be able to look at that. But one thing that Scott mentioned is the difference between state regulated and FDA approved. So psilocybin is not FDA approved, meaning that it is still an illegal substance on the FDA level. So what we have now is state regulation that's happening. And so there's a difference in those models, but what exists right now is that when someone is seeking services for psilocybin in a state regulated model, you can have a variety of indications. Somebody could seek services for growth, that they're stuck, and just move forward. They don't need to have a certain diagnosis to qualify for those services. That if FDA approval occurs for that, or when I should say that occurs, that likely is going to change that, because then it will be like other classes of medications that have specific indications for access. So right now we're in the state model where there's a lot of flexibility with access to this, and still wanting to preserve to make sure that it's appropriate for everyone. So let's talk a little bit about what state regulation has done. So prior to Proposition 122, or state legalization in Colorado, there were no standards for safety protocols. Basically, anybody could do psilocybin any way they want. So this was basically the work of, and we call it underground work. There were no required trainings or credentialing. There was no screening criteria that was established for appropriate patients. There was no mandated prep sessions or mandated integration sessions. There was no testing for the mushrooms that were used in those sessions. And there's no accountability or oversight. So this resulted in highly variable experiences. And, there are I'm sure there are a lot of individuals that got high quality care, but it's just something that couldn't be guaranteed because there wasn't a legal path to really prove that someone has done the training in order to be qualified to sit for these sessions. So that led into a lot of inconsistency practice and the potential for more harm. So since the Proposition 122 has been regulated, this is a safety first framework. And so now it's required licensed facilities. Colorado, they're called Healing Center. In Oregon, they're called service centers. And so that takes a lot of oversight from the state government to regulate what's happening in those healing centers to make sure things are done properly. It's also a defined scope of practice. We'll talk about what is required under the state law for someone to seek a psilocybin service. There are licensed facilitators now, and Colorado has a variety of different facilitator licensing types. And so that's designed to better integrate into our current existing healthcare model. There's structured supervised settings, and that's helpful for the learning experience and opportunity, making sure that before anyone is doing any psilocybin with clients that they have that proper training. And there's also a formal grievance process, and so a formal complaint process, which protects the user, which leads to more consistent care and clear expectations with ethical frameworks, and then ultimately accountability for providers and patients to make sure that they're getting what they're signed up for. So what does it take to become a licensed clinical facilitator in Colorado? Well, it's a very in-depth training requiring 150 hours of direct didactic training. These programs need to be state approved before, so you can't just do any 150 hours. It's a state approved program. There has to be 40 hours of supervised practicum. So this is working directly with the medicine in some type of setting. And being able to facilitate and see exactly how the sessions are done and working through that. And then in addition, after you have a training license, then there's an additional 40 hours of consultation that occurs so that you have a network and basically creating a community of support so that as questions come up, and as you're working through cases with psilocybin, that there's always a network for individuals to help support and create safety, structure, and high ethical standards. So what are the Colorado specific state requirements? So state requirements is that psilocybin is approved for adults 21 and older, must be done in a licensed healing center with rare exceptions to that. There are a few exceptions, but the basics of it is it needs to be done in a licensed healing center with approved facilitators. Again, there are different types of facilitator levels, so it has to be one that's approved from the state. And there are consents that are required, including a required screening form and a full informed consent that happens ahead of time so that every scenario that may come up is addressed and prepared for the client. So who's the ideal candidate to send for referral? So as Dr. Shannon mentioned, really individuals that are stuck and maybe seeking deep personal growth, meaning making, or having emotional processing of something that may be coming up. These individuals may carry treatment-resistant diagnosis like treatment-resistant depression or difficult to treat diagnosis like PTSD or substance use disorder. The also good referrals are anyone looking for that are in existential crisis. So that could be something at end of life, like some of the studies have shown with cancer, terminal cancer and existential crisis at end of life. But it could be for someone that's just lost purpose and meaning and need to work. The person needs to have good psychological stability and be ready for intensive work, be ready to do the work. And I think that that's a really key piece with utilizing these medicines. It's not a passive process. It's not like taking SSRIs every day and just having that support. It's a very active journey and it's an active work. And so we look for psychological stability to ensure that a person can engage to make that the most beneficial. A solid support system is also required, especially for out-of-state referrals. Wholeness requires that they come with a support system, one support person through their treatment at Wholeness, but also a support system to go back to help. A person should have some motivation for insight and a desire to explore what's happening, looking for new perspectives or wanting a change. So a lot of different varieties of conditions and situations that would be really appropriate for a referral. So what's the path to access care at healing centers? So healing centers required by the state for an initial screening. And so this is determining if there are any contraindications, looking for any type of mental health instability, looking for cardiac history that may be a contraindication. So that screening is mandatory. And there's also mandatory prep sessions. Right now in Colorado, there's one mandatory prep session. And many different healing centers have set up that more prep is recommended or needed. And that's typically dependent on the person's case. So some people are going to need a little bit more prep than just the one, but state requires one. Then you have the administration of the psilocybin. And so that is done in a therapeutic setting. And then you have the facilitation. And so we have the facilitators that are staying during the entire administration session. And that is dependent on dose. So depending on the dose of psilocybin one gets will help determine how long that facilitation will take. And then finally, you have integration. And so Colorado requires integration. So one integration session. So we look at that as like a 1-1-1, one prep, one administration to one integration. So referring to healing centers is a collaborative process. So if there are patients or clients that you're looking to identify and refer, a great place to start is just to screen out some of the basics. So looking at, again, mood stability, and if there's questions about cardiovascular risk factors, we can answer those and being able to assess that. And then making the referral over where we will do our own screening and then prepare the patient. They will come to the center for the administration sessions, and then integration happens right after the session and can continue after the journey. The goal of looking at the collaborative process is how do we integrate with their existing care team? And so if they're being referred from another center, of really having a good understanding of what's happening with that particular client, what are the goals or identified intentions for sending them over for this care service, and then how can we work together to create easy handoffs that feel supportive and collaborative, both to come to the center, but as we also hand back care to the referring provider. So there are some continued resources here for exploration. So these are the resources for all the studies that were in the presentation. Oh,
So,
we don't have the last slide. Okay, well, the last thing that we wanted to share with you is that our next webinar will be on April 7th from 6 to 7 p.m. And our webinar topic is One Label, Many Brains, using brain mapping to personalize mental health care. So depression, anxiety, and ADHD, they share diagnostic labels, but no two brains are the same. So brain mapping helps reveal these unique patterns. And so we'll take a deep dive into that and help clinicians identify those patterns and help understand more personalized care approach through the utilization of brain maps.